Most people think a pharmacy is a simple business. You buy drugs wholesale, you sell them retail, you charge a dispensing fee. Someone picks up their prescription, everyone goes home. That is not how this business works. The pharmacy you walk into is one of the most financially complex retail operations in existence. And the reason most independent pharmacies are disappearing, while CVS, Walgreens, and Walmart keep expanding, has almost nothing to do with who has better service. It has everything to do with a system that most pharmacists working behind the counter don't fully understand themselves. Here's the number that breaks the illusion. The average independent pharmacy operates on a net profit margin of roughly 2 to 3%. That sounds thin. It is thin. But the real problem isn't the margin. It's that the margin can go negative. On a drug you are legally required to dispense. On a prescription you are legally required to fill. Because of a pricing mechanism you have almost no control over. And understanding that mechanism explains everything about why this industry looks the way it does. There are two versions of this business. Independent pharmacy, you own the store, the inventory, the relationships with your customers. Chain pharmacy, CVS, Walgreens, Rite Aid, Walmart. You operate inside a corporate structure with centralized purchasing, insurance contracts, and enormous negotiating power. The economics of these two businesses look almost nothing alike. An independent pharmacy in a mid-sized American city typically fills somewhere between 200 and 400 prescriptions a day. Annual revenue might run between $3 million and $8 million. Sounds like a real business. Until you understand where that revenue actually comes from. Roughly 90% of all prescriptions in America are paid for not by the patient, but by a third party. An insurance company, a government program, an employer benefit plan, which means the independent pharmacist is not really selling to the customer standing at the counter. They are selling to an invisible intermediary who sets the price, decides what gets reimbursed, and takes a cut of every transaction, whether the pharmacy likes it or not. That invisible intermediary, is the pharmacy benefit manager, and it is the most important thing to understand about this business. Pharmacy benefit managers, PBMs, sit between drug manufacturers, insurance companies, and pharmacies. On paper, they exist to negotiate drug prices down, to use their bargaining power to get cheaper drugs for patients and insurers. In practice, they have become one of the most profitable and least understood businesses in American healthcare. The three largest PBMs, CVS Caremark, Express Scripts, and OptumRx, together process roughly 80% of all prescriptions filled in the United States. When you hand your insurance card to a pharmacist, a PBM somewhere is determining how much the pharmacy gets paid for that drug, whether that drug is even covered, which pharmacy you're allowed to use, and whether the pharmacist can tell you if there's a cheaper option available. That last one is not a hypothetical. For years, PBM contracts contained gag clauses that legally prohibited pharmacists from telling patients that they could pay less for a drug out of pocket than through their insurance. Federal law banned these clauses in 2018. But the broader power of PBMs to set reimbursement rates remained almost entirely unchecked. When you fill a prescription, here is roughly what happens. The pharmacy acquires the drug, either from a wholesaler or directly from a manufacturer. They dispense it to the patient. They submit a claim to the PBM. The PBM reimburses the pharmacy, at a rate it has predetermined, regardless of what the pharmacy actually paid for the drug. That reimbursement rate is called the maximum allowable cost, or MAC. And here is the trap. MAC rates are set by the PBM. They are not publicly disclosed. They can be changed at any time, and they can be set below the pharmacy's actual acquisition cost, which means a pharmacy can legally dispense a drug, get reimbursed by the PBM, and lose money on the transaction. Not occasionally, routinely. In 2019, a study found that independent pharmacies were being reimbursed below their cost on roughly 15 to 25% of generic drug claims. 15 to 25% of their volume was actively losing money, and they had no meaningful ability to refuse. Because if you refuse to fill a PBM's prescription, you lose access to the patients covered by that PBM's plans, which could be the majority of your customer base. Most people assume drug prices are set by manufacturers. The reality is far more complicated, and far more profitable for the intermediaries. A drug manufacturer sets a list price, called the wholesale acquisition cost, or WAC. But almost nobody actually pays that price. Insurance companies negotiate discounts through PBM's government programs, get statutory discounts. Hospital systems negotiate their own contracts. And pharmacies, depending on their size and negotiating power, pay somewhere between the list price and a deeply discounted negotiated rate. The difference between the list price and what's actually paid is called the rebate, and rebates are where enormous amounts of money quietly change hands. Drug manufacturers pay rebates to PBMs in exchange for preferred placement on the PBM's formulary, the list of drugs that are covered and recommended. In 2022, total drug rebates in the United States were estimated at over $200 billion. $200 billion flowing from manufacturers to PBMs as the price of access to patients. The question of how much of that $200 billion gets passed along to patients versus how much stays with the PBM is one of the most contested questions in American healthcare. The PBMs say most of it flows through. Independent analyses suggest a significant portion does not. Opening an independent pharmacy requires more capital than most people expect. A typical startup runs between $400,000 and $600,000 for a retail location. That includes leasehold improvements, build-out, fixtures, dispensing counter, typically $80,000 to $150,000. Pharmacy software, the system that processes prescriptions, manages inventory, and handles billing, $20,000 to $50,000 up front, plus ongoing monthly fees. Initial drug inventory, the single largest upfront cost, typically $150,000 to $250,000. Because unlike most retail businesses, a pharmacy must stock a comprehensive range of medications before it fills a single prescription. A patient comes in with a prescription. You either have the drug or you don't. If you don't, they go somewhere else, and they usually don't come back. Licensing adds another layer. State pharmacy licenses typically run $500 to $2,000. DEA registration, required to dispense controlled substances, $888 for a 3-year cycle. National Provider Identifier, free but required. Credentialing with each insurance plan and PBM to a process that can take 3 to 6 months, and during which you cannot get paid for prescriptions covered by those plans. That credentialing gap, the period between opening and receiving your first insurance reimbursements, is where many new pharmacies run into serious cash flow problems. You're filling prescriptions, paying for drugs, and waiting for payment for months. Most independent pharmacies source their drug inventory through one of 3 major wholesalers, McKesson, AmerisourceBergen, and Cardinal Health. Together control roughly 90% of the pharmaceutical distribution market in the United States. The terms you negotiate with your wholesaler determine a significant portion of your profitability. Large chains negotiate directly and receive steep discounts. Independent pharmacies negotiate through buying groups, organizations that aggregate the purchasing power of hundreds of independents, to secure better terms than any single pharmacy could achieve alone. The generic drug business is where wholesaler relationships matter most. Generics account for roughly 90% of all prescriptions filled in the United States by volume, but only about 20% of total drug spending, because generics are cheap. The margin on a brand name drug might be modest, but predictable. The margin on a generic can swing wildly, depending on how many manufacturers are producing it and whether there are supply disruptions. When a generic has many manufacturers, prices are low and margins are thin. When a manufacturer exits the market or a supply disruption hits, prices can spike dramatically. A drug that cost the pharmacy $5 last month might cost $50 next month if the PBM hasn't updated its MAC rate to reflect the new cost. The pharmacy gets reimbursed at the old price and absorbs the loss. If front-end prescription margins are thin and often negative, how does any independent pharmacy survive? The answer, like the car dealership is that the money isn't where you think it is. Compounding. Compounding pharmacies mix custom medications for individual patients at doses or in forms not commercially available. A child who can't swallow a tablet, a patient who needs a lower dose than manufacturers produce, a medication reformulated without an allergen. Compounding is time-intensive, but the margins are dramatically higher than standard dispensing, sometimes 40 to 60%, because there is no PBM setting a MAC rate on a custom mixed medication. Specialty pharmacy, specialty drugs, biologics, cancer medications, medications for rare diseases, represent roughly 2% of all prescriptions, but over 50% of total drug spending. The margins on specialty drugs are not dramatically higher per unit, but the absolute dollar amounts are much larger, and the patient relationships with patients managing chronic conditions who need ongoing support, are among the most durable in healthcare. Medication synchronization and adherence programs. A patient who picks up all their medications on the same day every month is a patient who doesn't comparison shop. Pharmacies that invest in synchronization programs dramatically increase prescription volume and customer retention. Front-end retail, vitamins, cosmetics, greeting cards, convenience items. Front-end retail in a pharmacy carries margins of 30 to 50%, compared to the razor-thin margins on prescriptions. The most profitable independent pharmacies run their front end like a gift shop and their prescription department like a loss leader that drives foot traffic. Clinical services, immunizations, point-of-care testing, blood pressure monitoring, medication therapy management. These services generate revenue outside the PBM reimbursement system, and often at much better margins. A flu shot administered by a pharmacist generates more net profit than many prescription fills. From 1990 to 2020, the number of independent pharmacies in the United States fell by roughly 30%. Not because Americans stopped needing pharmacies, because the system was restructured in ways that favored scale. PBM contracts became more restrictive. Reimbursement rates fell. DIR fees, direct and indirect remuneration fees, retroactive clawbacks that PBMs assess on pharmacies months after a claim is paid, made cash flow unpredictable. A pharmacy might receive a reimbursement check in January and receive a notice in July that a portion of that payment is being clawed back because of quality metrics, because of formulary compliance, because of contractual provisions so complex that many pharmacists cannot fully explain them. In 2021, independent pharmacies paid an estimated $9.1 billion in DIR fees, $9.1 billion retroactively clawed back from the revenue pharmacies had already received and spent. The three major PBMs are owned by the three largest health insurance companies, which are also some of the largest pharmacy chains. CVS owns CVS Caremark and CVS Pharmacy. United Health Group owns OptumRx and a network of pharmacies. They set the reimbursement rates for competing pharmacies while simultaneously competing with them for patients. The independent pharmacist is playing a game where the referees own the other team. So what does owning a pharmacy actually make? The average independent pharmacy generates roughly $3 to $5 million in annual revenue. Net profit, after all costs, runs between 2 and 4%. That's $60,000 to $200,000 per year. For a business requiring $400,000 to $600,000 to open, carrying enormous inventory risk, and operating inside a reimbursement system you don't control. The pharmacist owner typically also works full-time as the pharmacist, earning a pharmacist's salary on top of the ownership margin. Total compensation for a well-run independent might reach $200,000 to $350,000 per year. For a specialty pharmacy or compounding pharmacy, significantly more. But the trajectory is difficult. Every year, the system becomes more complex. Reimbursement rates get squeezed further. DIR fees expand. And the three companies that control 80% of prescription reimbursement keep getting larger. The pharmacy you walk into, is not a simple retail business. It is a small operator inside a system designed by very large ones, fighting for margin on every prescription. In a reimbursement structure, it did not negotiate and cannot change. The drug on the shelf was never really the product. The relationship with the patient was. And the independents who survive are the ones who understood that before the system made it impossible to survive on prescriptions alone. If this gave you a new perspective, subscribe.